Alright, back with another fake rock waterfall. I did one about a year ago that was of a canyon theme. I kept having so many requests to do a gray rock, like rainforest project, that's why I did this one. So the goal was to create an easier to create waterfall. Plus, the other goal was to create a waterfall that was much easier to clean than the one I did before. So I think I succeeded in creating a waterfall that was easier to clean, but this might actually be a little bit more difficult to build than the previous waterfall I did. Research whether or not your pet would appreciate having a waterfall in their cage. Bearded dragon is definitely not appropriate. Um, it raises the humidity level. There's obviously the possibility of the bearded dragon drowning. So the other thing is I use silicone in this project, just like the other project, the other waterfall. Here you can see the four different pieces. You got the base piece, you got the pond itself that goes into the base piece, and you have the filter, the water pump, and the sort of camouflaging helmet that goes over the filter. So here what I'm doing is putting in the pond itself into the base. You got the filter in back there, putting in or on the camouflaging helmet. So to really realize the benefit of this project compared to the other one, which you might want to check out, is you want to imagine that base to be a much, much larger piece, like the size of that table. And then you can see the benefit of just being able to pick up that smaller pond, which is camouflaged as if to be part of the main piece. Be able to pick up the smaller pond, dump out the water, replace it quickly, whereas the other project, you either had to be Mr. Universe or get someone's help, or obviously siphon out the water. So definitely an advanced project, but let's get started. You definitely want to wear a dust mask. Helps protect you from the particles and whatnot. What I'm doing here is drawing out a sort of floor plan for the pond piece itself. And really it's the pond piece that's going to catch all of the water. The only other section that's going to have water on it is obviously the camouflaging helmet. So I'm cutting out some rectangles, just like the other project. And I'm gonna, I think they're about 2.5 by 1.5, but they could be about 3 inches tall. So I've got all those organized into the shape I want. You can see the filter there in the back. So I'm going to cut out that shape. And then I'm going to start gluing on those aforementioned rectangles. Try to build up the height. And really what you want to do is figure out how deep the water line is going to have to be in order for the filter to work. And just like with a lot of other projects I've done, I decided to change my mind on a particular aspect of the design. And in this particular case, I wanted more space for the filter to live, just in how the water flowed out and how it would look and function. So I extended a certain corner of the pond itself, and really what I should have done was give it about 1 inch more in width for the filter to live, because it ended up being a little too tight. What I'm going to do here is trace around the base of the pond unit. Just going to mark it there, get the shape out. And I'm going to measure about 1/2 inch outwardly, the marker, and just basically connect the dots. So I've got this, and what I'm doing here is I really need that amount of space as sort of like a buffer zone for when I build up the surrounding landscape, which is what I'm doing here. I've got some packing material You can use any type of styrofoam, it doesn't really matter. I usually get my styrofoam at Home Depot, but anytime you get some packing material, obviously you can use that. What I'm doing here is creating, or beginning to create, that camouflaging unit for the filter itself. And really the goal of both of the waterfall projects was to camouflage the filter, because anybody can put in the filter into any type of either tank or setup and create a waterfall. The goal is to really create a realistic waterfall, in which case you would have to camouflage the filter in this case. So building the wraparound, and what I'm doing is using Loctite's Power Grab, which is very similar to liquid nails. And the benefit is it grabs on very quickly so that you can move very quickly in your sculpting and gluing. Just allows you to progress at a much faster rate. So just putting the top of the camouflaging helmet on there. Creating a lip that the water is actually going to flow out of the filter onto this sort of extension of rock and then pour out into the pond itself. And creating kind of a top there and the bottom to, I guess, further camouflage that filter. And what I ended up using was the Repto filter, the same filter I used in the other waterfall. It's a filter that removes bacteria because it's got a filtration system, plus it's obviously got the pump. What I'm doing here is extending the pond piece to attempt to cover up that seam. And here, once I've got that camouflaging sort of helmet built, I'm going to start gluing on some pieces that will make that piece look a little bit more organic, as if it could possibly exist in nature. Another good thing to do is just pick away at the styrofoam itself to create a natural look. So I've got two pieces here, the same width and same size. And what I'm going to do is, with a little nail, obviously you could use glue here just to keep these pieces together, but just right in the center, and then with a knife cut along and try to shape out a rock. And you can really get some realistic looking rocks just from this technique itself. So gluing on more rocks on that top part. And that's what it ended up looking like. This is the finished piece, just to be able to show you before and after. What I'm doing here is cutting away the bottom of the hide. Ended up creating a little hide. Cutting out this bottom, and it'll actually become the roof. Did this same thing on a much larger scale for the first waterfall, the canyon waterfall. So I'm also going to put a whole bunch of little rectangles to separate that hide from the inner piece. And I'm going to go ahead and glue on that roof of the hide itself. And glue on some of the top part just to sort of build up that hide, making it seem as if it's part of the landscape, even though it's hollow underneath. That's how the hide ended up looking. It's the finished shot of the hide. What I'm going to do here is create a little bit more detail. You can just go back in whenever and start carving out from that styrofoam. And really what you want to do is create this landscape in a very uneven way where the landscape goes up in certain spots and then goes down. Cutting away pieces here, I'm going to put this in the base of the pond. So at this point it kind of looks like a swimming pool in that the edges go straight down at a 90-degree angle. And I'm going to paste these pieces that look like this all around the base of the pond just to try to give it more of a realistic look with a descension of landscape down into the water. Gluing in some rocks here all throughout the base of the pond, trying to create as realistic a look as possible with all these little rocks. So I've got a ton of little rocks, a bunch of detail in that base pond. And you can see how this is looking. So really you're imagining that larger piece that this pond goes into to be much larger, and then you see the benefit of the system of being able to just take out the smaller pond. So here what I just showed you was I had mismeasured as far as the opening for the filter. So I'm going to try to extend the height. A little piece for the cord of the filter to go out. It'll just go out through the bottom of that helmet. You could obviously have this go out through the top. With the other waterfall, I think it went out through the top that I built. So I'm going to start building up the rocks around that helmet-like piece that camouflages the filter. And with any project I do, usually there's some gaps that get inadvertently created. You want to fill those up before you start grouting. So what I've got here is white non-sanded grout. You can use sanded. I use non-sanded because it's easier to thin out. It's easier to maintain the detail you've done in the polystyrene. You want to keep adding grout and then a little bit more water and then more grout. What I'm doing here is putting in some cheap acrylic paint. Because the grout that I get comes in the color of white, and I'm already building with polystyrene, which is white. So I like using a color just to be able to tell where I've covered and where I've not covered. So you can see the consistency here. It's thin, but it's not watery thin. You can see the speed in which it's flowing down that rock there. So you don't want to create it too thin or else it's just going to break and flake off. And you definitely want to turn each piece over and get the base of each piece. And what I did was cover each piece in 3 layers of grout. Moving on to a second layer here. And there's really no need to color the second layer because it's just going to go over top of the first layer, which is already covered or colored. And this is the last layer, using another colored layer to be able to tell where I've been. So you can see how it's coming together now, putting in that pond piece into the base. And got the filter helmet, I guess you could call it, going in there. What I'm doing here is mixing up some very thick grout. So very little water. And what I did, like I mentioned earlier, is I had mismeasured the opening of that helmet that camouflages the filter. So I needed to push the filter up about 1/4 inch. So I'm creating a little bit of a base as sort of like a boost for the filter to be a little bit taller when it sits in that pond. So learn from my mistakes. Really the lesson here is to just create that opening in the camouflaging unit to be a little bit bigger, and you can always close it later. It's much easier to add thick grout, as I'm doing here, trying to close up a seam. So sometimes with these projects you get these big gaps in which you want to go back in order to, and case in point, you've got this huge gap between the pond itself and the base unit. What I'm going to do is use some of that same thick grout to try to create a few little areas which will have the landscape of the base sort of rising upward in order to attempt to camouflage that seam. You can see here the finished product. You get quite a few little areas sort of looking like crocodile teeth going upward and covering up that seam. Here what I've done is purposely left a gap because I knew I was going to have an area where I can grip to be able to lift the pond out. And with some of that same thick grout, you can go back in and redefine some edges for your detail. And then sometimes what I do is after I've applied some of that thick grout in order to create more details, go back in with some fine grade sandpaper and kind of rough out some of the edges. Sometimes you'll get some sharp edges and it won't look too good. Here what I'm doing is I'm going to create a test. So I'm using some non-toxic acrylic sealant, just one layer. Even though it's not been painted, it's not been finished, I'm going to put this layer on in order to do a full test just to see how the waterfall looks and to see if it's actually functioning without, leaking all over the place. So I've got the filter in there, got the little helmet on there, you can see it. It's all ready to go. I've allowed this to dry for like 48 hours. Putting in some water, and voila, we've got a little test. And what ended up happening is there was a leak created, and you can see right there on the right side, lower right, the way slow water moves along a textured surface is because it's moving so slowly, it'll tend to, you can see a little leak there, it'll tend to go wherever the surface kind of leads it, sometimes moving at a sideways diagonal angle, which is what happened here. So what I ended up doing was a couple of different things. I extended sort of that lip where the water cascades down from, extended that so it would be more separated from that rock base. The other thing I did was create these little ridges, and I definitely went a little overboard. If you decide to do this, you really don't have to create these to the extent that I did. But the idea here is that these ridges would catch the water, the slow-moving water that tends to gravitate to its texture. If you create these ridges, the water will flow down and it'll catch on one of these ridges and basically go wherever the surface directs it to. So it's difficult to explain this. You really just have to do a test to make sure. See, along there you can see that any water going slightly sideways is going to catch that ridge and it's going to direct it right back down into the pond. So as you can see here with another test, or maybe you can't see because it's so badly lit, you can see here the concept of the ridge is basically pulling that water back down into the pond itself. What I'm doing here is, after doing the test, I left the water in there and I painted around the water line. because because this project is so organic, there's really no way of telling where the water line would be unless you were to do something like this. And I knew I wanted to know where the water line would be in order to differentiate between the colors of how it would look, the surface having water on it and then not having water on it. What I'm doing here is, because this project hasn't been sealed up and strengthened, this is something you can really neglect, to make sure that the inner pond doesn't break. I'm going to get the water out in such a way that, because that's actually a lot of weight having that water in there, instead of just lifting it up in its current state, getting the water out in a safe manner so that it doesn't break under the weight of the water. What I'm using here is the poor man's paint gun. Got a dollar store water bottle, and put in some very dark gray acrylic paint, mix it with water so that it's thin enough to work its way through the nozzle, and you've got a really cheap, fast way of covering with paint a lot of ground in a very quick amount of time. What I'm doing here is mixing up a big old batch of earthy brown color. Go in with brown, and then later I use green just to block in a whole bunch of earthy colors before I put on other types of detail. What I'm doing here is covering up that black water line with white. I couldn't use white initially because the color of the grout was white, so it wouldn't have stood out. And I'm going to start to paint those two rocks that are above water, above the water line, that is. And decided to give some of the rocks some color, some different varying color, even though I ended up covering up this color of sort of a weird burnt orange. I don't know why I decided to use that. Ended up covering it up with like a green of some sort. But you can see I'm maintaining the water lines around those particular rocks that are jutting up. As you can see, I put in sort of a base green to below the water line, and putting in some rocks here and there for the base of the pond. And then coloring that camouflaging helmet there. What I'm doing here is covering up some of what the gap between the two pieces will end up showing. So you certainly don't want white showing through there, so covering up with a dark brown. Now going in and painting some of those rocks. So I've already got a base gray color. I'm going to go back in, cover up some of the spots that didn't get covered, and just start putting in some layers. What I'm doing here is the dry brush technique. You using a very light gray going over a dark gray color, you can really create some interesting effects. And you're getting rid of most of the paint on your paintbrush so that it comes off in this sort of speckled manner. So you can really see it here, and there's really no artistic skill going on. It's just the texture of the grout pulling off some of the paint that's left over from the brush. And putting in some what will appear as if it's plant life, some moss and green growth of some sort. And then just kind of blocking in some green color if it's the rainforest. You're definitely going to have some green-like landscape. Putting in sort of It's a light green, almost yellow color. When you do this, you want to make sure it's really uneven so it looks a little bit more natural. And also doing the dry brush technique on the rocks in the pond itself. Now covering up or trying to diminish that water line because it looks a little too thick. And I ended up covering up the water line quite a bit, but if you look at the finished product, you can see, it's still there, or at least an indication of it. What I ended up deciding to do is trying to, instead of have every single rock be gray, trying to go in and create some different colored rocks. So I've got a brown rock here. And this is really a process. You see a dark brown color on the right and the highlight color using the dry brush technique being, in this case, a very light beige, just to sort of bring out some of the texture of the rock. What I've got here, this is a little bit difficult to understand, but it's very thinned out, obviously with water, acrylic dark green. Very thinned out, and I wanted it thin because I wanted it to be transparent, and I'm going to paint everything below the water line with this color, and wanted it to be transparent so that you could see still an indication of the color of those rocks that are in the pond itself. Trying to give the illusion that it's covered in water, because obviously the water itself, I'm not going to put a food dye in there. It's just going to be clear water. So you need to try to fool the eye with acrylic paint in this case. Putting in some dark areas, just using a very dark gray. And going over into the pond itself, putting in, trying to, I guess, separate some of those rocks with a dark gray. And now's the time to actually put in the indication of the white foam, which if you do any searches on the internet for waterfalls, all of them will have this white foam, basically because of the speed of the water, which we're not going to have because it'll be really slow moving water. But just in case you want to put in the illusion that it's an actual waterfall, you're going to want to add this white suggestion that there's white foam in your waterfall. And trying to, I guess, accentuate that water line that is close to what will be the base of the fall itself. And then putting in some, as if the water is splashing. So completely finished. Now is the time to seal it. And what I do is use 4 layers of a non-toxic acrylic sealant. If you go to the website, I do have a list of materials that I use. This particular product is acrylic, and it's called Shields All. But there are other products you can use. You want to make sure it's non-toxic. This particular sealant is water resistant, but it is not, or I don't believe it is completely waterproof. Now what you can see here is I've got one of the pieces, actually 2 of them, outside. And the reason why I'm outside is I've allowed those 4 layers to dry, and I'm now about to put on silicone. And I've got to warn you about silicone if you've never used it before. It is quite harsh when it's wet. We all know silicone. In this particular case, it's aquarium grade silicone. We all know it's non-toxic when dry because it's the stuff that's been in fish tanks, in the corners of fish tanks, sealing it for decades upon decades. But when silicone is wet, it is quite toxic. So ideally, you want to apply this stuff outside so that there's adequate ventilation. If not, maybe a garage or at least right next to an open window. But you want to wear gloves. You see I've got gloves on there. You want to wear professional goggles. It'll even affect your eyes. You want to wear a professional gas mask. This stuff is pretty intense. So what I ended up doing is applying a very thin layer, a very thorough layer, to all of the sections that would be covered by water or would have water flowing over it 24/7, 365. So in this particular sealant, I was able to get at a local hardware store. The acrylic I had to get on the internet. So, like I say, just covering up all of the particular surface areas that I knew would have water flowing over it or sitting on it 24/7. Then what I ended up doing, see a shot of the tub, plastic tub, had both of those pieces sit in that tub for about 5 days outside. You don't want to have silicone in your house curing. The smell is quite intense. And so that's dried. And as a last stage, I'm applying a little bit more of that acrylic sealant and applying some colored sand, in this case gray sand, for that gray rock. This will give a lizard traction. It'll also diminish some of that shiny finish that the sealant will leave behind. What I'm doing here is, it's definitely a good idea to apply some sand to any surface area that's going to come in contact with another piece, because the nature of the surface when the sealant dries is very tacky, very sticky. So you don't want to have these pieces stuck to each other. So applying a layer of dry sand will ensure that you've got two surfaces that are going to be able to come apart easily. And then I'm brushing away the loose sand from the entire project after sprinkling it on there. Going ahead and putting in the base pond into a larger base piece, that is. Putting in the filter and putting on the camouflaging piece to the filter itself. Putting in the water. Go ahead and plug it in, and there you have it, fake rock waterfall. So please be advised as to the dangers of using silicone and the dangers of creating a waterfall project for a lizard or any other creature that it's not appropriate for. Obviously there's quite a bit of issues as far as sitting water, raising humidity level. But be sure to check out the other waterfall that I've got on the website. And good luck in creating your rainforest waterfall. Thanks for watching.